Welcome to the Stata Crash Course Day 2. Today we're going to be learning about data cleaning. And we're going to be doing basic and then what I would say are intermediate manipulations of the data. So yesterday, just a quick review, we covered getting started with Stata, some basic commands. Those of you who have seen Stata before had likely seen a lot of those before, but maybe it was a good reminder. Maybe you learned one or two new ones. We then learned how to explore data, a few different commands that would summarize the statistics, whether it be just in some row or in some table or visually. We went over some best practices, including how to properly structure our directories and how to use do files. And at the very end, we learned how to import different types of data. In the final exercise, I asked you to use these skills that we learned yesterday and go beyond just a little bit. It looked like all of you who sent me your do files were able to figure out how to create the open date, and some of you also created the open year variable. If you didn't create the open year variable, please make that change on your do file for the end of today. And also make sure that if you did not include a save line at the end of that do file, that you do that, because we are going to want to work with those data. Looking ahead to today, we're going to first go over what is data cleaning. Then we're going to do some basic manipulations, and as I said, what I would call some intermediate manipulations, and then we'll end. We are again going to have a break in the middle of the day. So today we are going to learn how to clean data. And it's really important that we learn how to do this well, because in reality, cleaning data often takes at least as much time as doing an analysis. You have to make sure that you really understand your data well, then you have to structure it and restrict it and do other things to it in just the right way to make it usable for your purposes. So when you first get data, like we did yesterday, you must explore them. And you have to ask yourself a few questions. For example, do these data cover our population of interest? And that could be individuals, that could be counties, that could be any other set of units that you might be interested in. Walmart stores, like we had yesterday, zip codes. It could also be some of those things over some period of time. Or it could simply be, for example, one unit, like the United States observed over a period of time. But you need to ask yourself, do these data cover every bit of my population of interest? If I want to do some analysis on, say, counties covering 1990 to 2006, and I want to have certain outcome variables of interest, I need to find out whether or not my data cover counties with those outcome variables of interest from 1990 to 2006. If my data do not, then my data are not sufficient in the beginning for my analysis of interest. So you need to figure out either some new project at that point or where you can get the data that will suffice for that. You also need to ask, do they include the variables that you need? Maybe they include a lot of the variables that you need, but not everything. Maybe you can supplement these data with some other data that will together give you everything that you need. You might ask, can you generate needed variables from these data? Maybe you have population by county by year, and maybe you have retail sales by county by year. And maybe you're interested in retail sales per capita by county by year. You may not have that last variable in your data, but you can create that from the other two variables that I mentioned. Going to number 4, it coincides with bullet point 2 here. Can you merge these data with others you need? So maybe you don't have all the variables that you need, but if you have some of those variables in this data set and you have the other variables in a different data set, can you combine them? And we'll talk about how we would do that in a little bit, but essentially you're going to need a common unit identifier to do that. This is a big one. Do you understand every variable of interest? Just because you think that some variable included in some data set is the variable that you want does not mean it necessarily is. Ask yourself, what do the documentation for these data say? Are these data the result of some administrative attempt by the government to cover everybody that you're interested in, or some organization's administrative data? Were they created using certain elements that might be of interest but lacking others? For example, if they are tax data, do they cover federal and state receipts? These sorts of questions need to be asked. And in general, you need to make sure that you do understand fully your variables of interest before you start using them. You should also ask yourself, are important variables missing key observations? We saw yesterday, Rep 78 in the auto data had 5 observations missing. You may actually find in whatever data set you have that most of your observations of interest are there, observations for some variable for your units of interest, but you may be missing some that are important. For example, county and smaller geographic regions often have data kind of blanked out in a lot of publicly available data sets. They want to make sure that they're not disclosing information on some small geographic area of interest that might shed light on any individual's outcomes or a firm's outcomes. So you need to double check that, for example, in county level data, you have all of the employment data that you actually want for some industry of interest. Maybe for some reason it was blocked out. In general, you just need to make sure that you understand your data before you use them and that they are sufficient. And if they are not sufficient, maybe you can clean them so that they are. So, as I said, if they're sufficient for your needs, you're now going to need to ask yourself, is this the exact sample that you want? Maybe you want county level data from 1990 to 2006, but you have county level data from 1978 to 2017. You don't need those extra years necessarily if your analysis does not require it. You can ask yourself, are the units of observation appropriate? Maybe you are interested in state level data and you have county level data. You don't necessarily need to go out and find state level data, although maybe that would be appropriate. But you may be able to aggregate your county level data into state level data. Ask yourself, are the data organized as you want? So this includes naming conventions. Maybe you want to change the names of your variables and label them differently, but you may also want to fundamentally change the structure of the data to suit your purposes. And we'll see, for example, when we reshape data toward the end of the day, how that might be done. You want to ask yourself, for example, do you want to normalize variables? Or, as I mentioned earlier, maybe you want to turn some variable into a per capita version of that variable for some geographic region. And you may want to combine data sets. So, very essentially, these are the questions to ask. Do the data need modification prior to analysis? And this is assuming that your data are sufficient for your needs. Do the data need modification prior to analysis? And the answer is pretty much always yes. You are almost never going to get data that are just right for you, sort of handed to you, and you just type in some command. I know this might have happened in 102 once or twice, but you are going to be doing the research projects now, so you are going to have to work with them quite a lot. And if the data do need modification, making those necessary changes is data cleaning. When you are data cleaning, this is very, very important. You must ensure that you do not create false data. And this could happen so many ways. I can't even begin to list them, but for example, maybe you somehow order population strangely and combine it with some other variable, and you call it some new variable, maybe even you call it a per capita version of that first variable, but maybe it does not actually reflect true per capita values of that variable. But then you use it as such, and maybe you even write a paper that says, you know, I used this data, I used these variables, and I got these outcomes. But in fact, no, you didn't. You just created. Maybe you didn't do it intentionally, but if it's not accurate, then it's not accurate. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. So you need to be very, very careful when you're data cleaning that you are not messing things up. You could also accidentally drop too many of your units of observation because you say, oh, for whatever reason, they're not relevant, but they do happen to be relevant for your analysis.